The 13th started as a normal working day at the office of the goods delivery company. None of the employees paid attention to the date until about 10 a.m. One of the managers, Tom, dropped the phrase, "I hope today will be without trouble." The usual chatter in the kitchen, the noise of printers and the smell of coffee. The staff was in a routine. Some were checking emails, others were answering customer calls. Everything went on as usual until the lights went out. For a couple of seconds, no one paid much attention to this, except for Ellie, the girl from the quality control department. Her desk was next to the server room, and when the lights went out, she noticed that a thick, oddly smelling haze began to escape from under the door. "Tom, come here," she shouted, without getting up from her chair. Tom came up and opened the door of the server room, recoiled. The interior of the room was black with soot. Wires, server racks, and even ceiling panels seemed to melt. "Someone has overloaded the system," he said nervously, watching the thick smoke fill the space. A few minutes later, the fire alarm went off and the evacuation began. But something went wrong. When the staff went down to the parking lot, it turned out that some of the people remained in the building. Those who were on the upper floors did not come out. First of all, everyone thought they were just stuck in the elevator because of the power outage. But the strange thing was that none of them answered the phone. "The connection is up. Probably because of the fire," said Mike, an IT technician, checking his phone. The office director, Ms. Wilson, decided to send several people back to find out what had happened. She called rescuers, but because of Friday evening the service was overloaded with calls. Ellie, Tom and Mike, not waiting for help, decided to go back inside. As they entered the building, they could already sense that something was amiss. The air was still, there was a smell of burning, and the glass doors leading to the corridor were cemented on both sides. "It's not just an electrical fault. It feels like someone is deliberately blocking the exit," Tom whispered, paying attention to the inscription that appeared on the inside of the glass, "You will not leave." "This hasn't been here before," Ellie said, looking around nervously. They went up to the 3rd floor to check the conference room where the staff were supposed to be. But the room was empty, except for one phone lying in the middle of the table. There was an unread message on the screen. "Someone is waiting in the server room. Be careful." Mike grabbed the phone, trying to figure out who it belonged to, but the owner of the number was missing from the company's employee list. "This is too much," he muttered, putting the phone back on the table. Footsteps. They were somewhere far away, on the top floor, and they were getting louder. Ellie froze, listening. It's not like walking. The hum grew louder until something hit the ceiling above them. There was a dining room on the 4th floor. Upon entering, the group discovered something inexplicable. Tables were overturned, and dark red stains were scattered on the walls, as if someone had spilled ketchup. However, the smell was not one that could be confused with sauce. Ellie pressed the sleeve of her sweater to her nose, fighting the urge to vomit. "There's someone here," she whispered. At that moment, the phone rang in the lobby. It was a stationary device, although the building should no longer have electricity. Tom picked up the phone. "You shouldn't have come back. You need to run." They ran downstairs, but the doors were blocked. The panic was growing. Ellie pointed to a side staircase leading to the basement. At some point, Mike stumbled, and a note fell out of his jacket pocket, which he seemed to have been trying to hide until that time. Ellie picked it up, quickly reading it aloud. It all started with the 13th server. "Don't touch him." They stopped in the hallway in front of the door leading to the basement. The old wooden structure was covered with deep scratches, as if someone was desperately trying to get out. Ellie looked at Tom nervously. "Did you know about this server? What is the 13th in question?" Tom, unlike her, looked strangely calm. 13th server. It was experimental. 2 months ago, the management installed it without our knowledge. None of us were supposed to touch it, not even the IT department. Ellie clutched the note in her hand, trying to connect everything in her head. Why didn't you tell us about this before? Because I thought it didn't matter, Tom snapped, pushing open the basement door. The basement was filled with a strange hum, as if a low vibrating echo was coming from the depths of the earth. Mike turned on his flashlight, illuminating a long concrete corridor hung with old wires and ventilation pipes. There was a pungent smell in the air, making it difficult for each of them to breathe. After a few meters, they came across a metal door with a sign, 13th server. Unauthorized entry is prohibited. There he is, Tom said, putting his hand on the door. Ellie took a step back. Are we really supposed to go there? Could it be a trap? But Tom ignored her. He opened the door, and the heavy metal sash opened with a booming sound, exposing the inside of the server room. Inside, there was a single server cabinet surrounded by a multitude of cables, randomly tangled and extending into the ceiling. On the screen of the monitor connected to the server, the message was flashing. System failure. Re-upload after 5 minutes and 47 seconds. Mike looked at his watch. If this happens, the system will start up again, and perhaps we can regain control of the building. But Ellie noticed something else. On the floor next to the server was a battered notebook covered with greasy stains. She picked it up, opening the first page. The words were written on it in large letters. It's their secret. Don't trust anyone. Tom came closer, snatching the notebook out of her hands. That's nonsense. We need to focus on rebuilding the system. Tom, wait, Ellie tried to object, but her voice was drowned out by a sharp sound when the server started making strange clicks. The monitor blinked, and the countdown began to accelerate. 4 minutes and 30 seconds, 3 minutes and 59 seconds. Mike rushed to the cables, trying to turn off the power. Something's wrong. The system does not obey commands. But the server wasn't their main problem. At this time, there was a screeching sound behind the team. The door they entered through slammed shut, and they heard a thud. Someone's here, Ellie whispered, shining her flashlight in the direction of the sound. Footsteps could be heard outside the door. They were confident, measured, and getting closer by the second. It can't be rescuers, Mike said, clutching his head. Maybe those employees who stayed in the building? Ellie asked, but even she didn't believe it. The door swung open. There was a figure in the hallway, a tall man in a black uniform. His face was hidden behind a mask, and he was holding a huge metal tool in his hands. He took a step forward. "Get out of there," he said in a low voice. Tom turned the light on him. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man was silent. Instead of answering, he lowered the tool, hitting the floor with such force that the concrete cracked. Ellie screamed. "Run!" They rushed to another exit, but the basement was built like a maze. The narrow corridors, locked doors, and lack of light made it difficult for them to navigate. Ellie looked at Thomas, who continued to pull on her arm. "Tell me the truth. What kind of server is this? Why would anyone want to kill us because of him?" Tom didn't answer until they were in a small storage room, barricading the door. "It wasn't just a server. This is a project of our management. They wanted to create a control system over people." Ellie looked at him in horror. "What do you mean?" "They developed a program that could be embedded in consciousness through visual images and sounds. This server is the first working prototype." Ellie was in shock. "Are you saying this is all an experiment? And those who stayed in the building? They were probably tested," Tom said hoarsely. At this time, Mike, who was standing against the wall, screamed. "They found us." The thuds on the door were getting louder. Ellie grabbed the notebook, flipping through the pages in search of an answer. She found a short entry on the last page. "If you want to get out, destroy the server. It's the only way out. We have to go back," she said, getting up. "Are you crazy?" "We won't get to him," Tom replied. Ellie sighed and looked at Mike. "We don't have a choice. You saw for yourself that this is not just a technical malfunction." Mike nodded, and they rushed back to the server room. The basement corridors were getting narrower and narrower. The air was heavy, as if the concrete walls were being deliberately compressed around them. The ceiling lamps, covered with a thick layer of dust, were flickering dimly, casting shadows that seemed alive. Ellie walked ahead, clenching her fists, trying to suppress her panic. Every sound, the creak of a pipe, a drop of water, the rustle of their own footsteps, echoed in their minds, as if someone was watching them. Who was this man? "What is it?" she asked in a whisper, turning to Tom. "I don't have an answer. Perhaps one of those who followed the experiment." His voice sounded subdued, as if he was trying not to show how scared he was. "If he's part of the project, why did he warn us to leave?" Mike looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to grab him from behind at any moment. "Maybe he has his own motives," Tom replied gloomily. They reached the server room, but the door was ajar. Ellie felt a cold stream of air rushing out from inside. There was a strange hum in the room, like a heartbeat. The server was flashing red, illuminating walls covered with unfamiliar symbols. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, looking at the patterns. "It's a code. They purposely left it so that no one could figure out what was going on," Mike said, leaning closer. "But that doesn't explain where these symbols came from." Ellie raised her hand to one of the inscriptions on the wall. His fingers were sticky with what looked like dried blood. There were obviously people here. And they didn't just write. They were leaving something behind. There was another note on the floor next to the server. This time the text was clearer. "Do you still think you can turn it off? Try. This is no longer a program. It's a mechanism." "What does that mean?" Ellie asked, showing the note to the others. Mike looked up at the server. "Perhaps they meant that it has become autonomous. He controls the processes himself, makes his own decisions." Tom went to the server console and tried to enter a shutdown command. A warning flashed on the screen. "You were warned." Then the text changed to, "Will you ruin their lives like they ruined yours?" "Who are they?" Ellie asked, peering at the screen. Tom shook his head. "I don't have time to figure this out. If we don't stop this, we will stay here forever." He pressed the confirmation key. The server shook as if resisting, and the lights in the room flickered. The rumble grew louder, turning into an almost deafening roar, and then everything went quiet. For a moment, it seemed like it was over. But suddenly the screens in the room started to light up, one by one. They displayed surveillance cameras. Ellie gasped, looking at the image. These were their colleagues, those who could not leave the building. They were sitting in a room, motionless, as if paralyzed. "They're alive," she said. "We have to get them out." But then one of the screens started showing something else. The camera was focused on their group in the server room. "They're seeing us," Mike said softly. A new message appeared on the screen. "Now it's your turn." There was a crash. Chunks of plaster began to fall from the ceiling. Ellie turned to the door, but there were already figures standing there. It was their colleagues, the ones who were on the screens. But their faces. They were empty, as if everything human had been taken away from them. "That's impossible," Mike muttered. One of them took a step forward. He was holding a metal rod in his hands, which he gripped with such force that his knuckles turned white. Ellie screamed. "It's not them. We have to run. We can't just leave them." Tom objected. But the people were moving closer, their steps synchronized, their movements mechanically precise. They're not our colleagues anymore, Mike finally realized. This is the server. He controls them. They rushed to the ventilation, the only escape route. Ellie got up first, pushing open the bars. Hurry up. They're already here. Mike's last words were lost in the din. One of the people grabbed his leg, pulling him down. Ellie tried to hold him back, but Tom pulled her by the arm. We don't have time. They won't stop. Ellie climbed into the vent, hearing Mike screaming downstairs. His screams suddenly stopped. We abandoned him, she whispered, moving forward. But Tom didn't answer. When they got outside, there was dead silence. The fire alarm went off, and the building seemed calm. Ellie turned to look at him, standing in the parking lot. We can't just leave. We have to do something, she said. But Tom was already moving away. His face was pale, his gaze blank. It's too late. Everything is already running. Ellie watched him get into the car and drive away, leaving her alone. She turned back to the office. There, behind the glass doors, she saw the figures again. They stood motionless, as if they were waiting for her to return. Ellie stared into the dark hole from which they had just emerged. The building behind them seemed dead, but it had its own threat, too quiet, too calm. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to banish the feeling that they were being watched even now. But now what? Mike died, Tom ran away, leaving her alone. A couple of hours later, while still within sight of the building, Ellie heard a noise. It was the sound of an engine, quiet, steady, approaching. Tom's car was coming back. What the hell? She whispered, clutching the stone in her hands just in case. The car stopped, but the door didn't open. Ellie moved closer, pressing herself against the concrete pillar. She looked inside and realized that Tom was still driving. His face tilted to the side, as if he had fallen asleep, or lost consciousness. She opened the door and gently touched his shoulder. Tom? His body went limp, falling into her arms. There were deep cuts on his chest, as if someone had deliberately driven the knife blade too slowly to cause more pain. The pocket of his shirt was cut open, and inside there was a note. Choose, stop them, or leave and live. You know where to find a way out. Ellie felt her legs go limp. Who wrote these notes? Why are they watching their every move? She couldn't leave Tom here, not even dead. Dragging his body into the back seat, she got behind the wheel and started the car. 20 minutes later, when she was on the road heading towards the city, Ellie began to feel that something was wrong. She looked in the rearview mirror and noticed, Tom's head was in a different position now. It's impossible, she muttered. The headlights picked out something on the road. A metal barrier, as if specially built to block the passage. She twisted the steering wheel, trying to slow down, but the car skidded on gravel, and they crashed into a sign. Ellie hit her head on the steering wheel, hearing the humming sound of a damaged engine. When she woke up, it hadn't been more than 10 minutes. When Ellie opened her eyes, she immediately felt that she was no longer alone. Tom's body disappeared from the back seat. Her breathing became ragged. After getting out of the car, she felt the night getting strangely cold. Looking up, she saw a man. The figure stood on the road in shadow, illuminated only by the remnants of the headlights. Who are you? Ellie screamed, her voice cracking with panic. There was no response. The man just raised his hand, pointing to the place where they came from. Her mind was fighting with itself. Escape? Go back? But her legs wouldn't obey her anymore. She went where the gesture indicated. After a while, Ellie found herself at the building again. But something has changed. There was another car in front of the doors now. She recognized it immediately. It was Mike's car. Inside, on the passenger seat, she saw a folder with documents. An autonomous data processing system. Experimental studies of the effects on the human psyche. She flipped through the pages, reading about the project they had developed. The idea was to create a system that could manage the team's teamwork while minimizing emotional mistakes. The system collected data from conversations, observations, and painful losses. Ellie shuddered when she read that the first experiment went wrong, but they decided to hush up the results. "They used us," she whispered. But a voice inside her told her that something didn't add up. The noise came again. This time it was the elevator in the building. There was someone inside him. Ellie felt her whole body tense up. The elevator stopped. 3 people got out of it, all in formal suits. "Miss West, are you still here?" They knew her name. They knew who she was. "We didn't expect you to stay," said one of them, a man with short gray hair. Ellie felt cold sweat trickle down her back. "Who are you?" "We're just observers. Everything that happened here was under your control." She took a step back, realizing that this conversation would never end in her favor. "You know how to complete this project, Miss West. The only question is whether you are willing to pay the price." Ellie stood in front of men in formal suits, feeling the adrenaline rush through her mind. The words "price" and "control" echoed in her head, like a mockery of all her attempts to survive. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Stop it," she shouted, feeling the tremor in her voice betray her fear. "Oh, but you understand, Miss West," the gray-haired man replied, taking a step closer. His face remained calm, but there was something terrifying about that calmness. He handed her a tablet, on the screen of which the countdown was displayed. 0:59, 0:58. "The choice has always been yours," he said. 2 buttons appeared on the screen, Start and Reset. "What is it?" Ellie asked, although she was already beginning to guess. "Your team. Mike, Tom, and even you. You were all part of the experiment. Unfortunately, this experiment has now come to an end. You can either activate the system or terminate it. But remember, any choice will have consequences." Ellie looked at the men, then back at the tablet. As if in response to her doubts, the door of the building opened from behind, and a stretcher was wheeled out of the darkness. Mike was lying on them. His eyes were open, but he wasn't moving. He's dead," Ellie managed, not believing her own eyes. "Not yet," the gray-haired man said softly. "But if you press reset, it will remain in this state. Eternal oblivion." "And the launch?" The man smiled for the first time. "You'll save his life, but yours will be a little shorter." Ellie froze, unable to breathe. The choice was monstrous. She slowly raised her finger to the screen, feeling a growing desperation squeeze her chest. "What do I get in return?" "What is it?" she asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "Answers," the man replied. Her finger hovered over the button. The time on the screen was coming to an end, 0:10. 00:09. "You were playing with us like with toys." Ellie screamed. "Perhaps," the gray-haired man nodded, his voice sounding almost gentle. "But some toys choose themselves." Ellie pressed the start button, everything happened instantly. A flash of light hit her in the face, there was a metallic hum, and the world around her disappeared, leaving only cold and silence. She felt her body becoming light, as if she was withdrawing from reality, dissolving into the void. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a small room. There was a monitor on the wall, on which an image was being broadcast, Mike, alive, but connected to the machines. Tom was there, whole, but clearly depressed. The gray-haired man's voice came from the speakers. "You saved them, Miss West. They're free now. And you've become part of the system." Ellie rushed to the door, but it was locked. A message appeared on the screen, "The surveillance has begun." The experiment continues. She screamed, realizing that her life now belonged to these people. She would never leave this room, she would never know what it was all about. Outside, beyond its borders, the world continued to live. Ellie's car was found empty, with a blood-stained seat. No one ever found out what happened to her, Mike and Tom. And the system continued to work, leaving new participants in an endless game of survival. And somewhere in that system, in the dark, Ellie was alive, and dead at the same time. 1. Forever. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it and write in the comments what you think about this story. Your feedback is very important. Until new meetings and new stories, there will be even more intriguing and exciting plots ahead. Thank you for your support and see you soon. Sometimes the most frightening stories don't happen at night or in abandoned houses. They happen in the most mundane places where we go every day, unaware that we might end up in someone's nightmare. This story is not just a scary story, it is a real event that has left behind many questions and horrifying details. Imagine, a young man who decided to spend a weekend in peace and quiet, rented a room in a small family motel. An ordinary trip to take a break from the city. But from the very beginning, something went wrong. Someone knocked on his door on the very first evening. No one answered when he asked who was there. Later, he discovered that the door to his room was slightly ajar, although he was sure that he had locked it at night. That was just the first oddity. The next morning, he found a strange note under his door. Leave the light on. It's important here. What would you do in such a situation? He decided to stay, blaming it all on someone's bad joke. And maybe that was his mistake. On the third night, he woke up to a strange sound. It was like scratching or a soft rustling behind the wall. When he got to the door, he saw that there was another note on the floor. Asterisk, if you can hear them, they already know you're here. Underscore. This person has not been in touch anymore. All that was left were his belongings and a surveillance camera that captured something that could not be explained by logic. So, this story is not just a set of frightening facts, it is a real chronicle of how an ordinary place became something completely different. If you think that this will never happen to you, watch it to the end. The young man, let's call him Adam, was a programmer. Living in a bustling city tired him, and he dreamed of escaping for a while to a place where he could just disconnect from the hustle and bustle. When he came across a website with budget motels, he chose one that was slightly off the tourist routes. The place looked cozy in the photos, and the reviews were a little strange, but nothing criminal. People wrote about outdated furniture or bad Wi-Fi, but nothing that could alert him. Adam arrived there late at night. The motel was small, with 5 rooms, and stood next to a dense forest. At the reception desk, he was met by an elderly man who looked tired and seemed a little annoyed. He quickly handed over the keys and muttered, "Breakfast is from 7 to 9. Be careful with hot water, it happens intermittently." The room turned out to be quite simple: a bed, a small table, a lamp, and the same old-style TV that was mentioned in the reviews. Adam, already exhausted from the long journey, did not pay much attention to the strange smell in the room, a mixture of dampness and something chemical. When he went to bed, there was a knock from the hallway. Barely audible, as if someone had accidentally bumped into the door. Adam went out to check, but the hallway was empty. He thought it was the wind, even though the windows were closed. The morning began with the fact that he was awakened by a knock on the window. When he looked out, a young woman in strangely outdated clothes was standing in front of him. She didn't say anything, just looked at him. Adam froze, and then, gathering his courage, opened the window a crack and asked, "Is there something you want?" The woman looked him straight in the eye and said, "Are you from number 3? "Yes," he replied, feeling his body tense up. "You'd better leave." Before he could ask any questions, the woman disappeared around the corner of the motel. He ran out after her, but found no one. He didn't know then that the third issue had a story of its own. At breakfast, in the small dining room, where everything was covered with a layer of dust, he tried to start a conversation with the owner. The man replied dryly that this woman sometimes visits the guests, and advised them not to pay attention to her. She's just not right in the head. It's not your problem, he said, giving Adam a look that Adam couldn't call friendly. But now Adam had a question: why the third room? In the evening, he decided to take a walk around the motel. The forest started just 3 meters from the parking lot, and he noticed that the path led somewhere deeper. After a few minutes of walking, he came across the remains of a stone well overgrown with bushes. It looks ancient. When he crouched down to take a closer look at it, it seemed to him that something was shining inside. He was curious, but the strange feeling of being watched made him come back. When he returned to the room, there was a note on the floor. It looked like it had been written a long time ago, the ink almost faded. "Pack up and leave. No one stays after the third night." The note sent a chill down his spine. He thought it was someone's stupid joke. Maybe the same elderly motel owner who was having fun this way. But something inside told him to be on his guard. He didn't sleep well that night. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by the sound of water. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the faucet in the bathroom was open and the water was draining into the sink. The bathroom light was flashing, creating an unsettling atmosphere. As he got closer, he noticed that the water in the sink was muddy, as if with dirt. Adam turned off the faucet and looked at the mirror. His heart stopped. On the fogged glass was written, "Are you from number 3? Adam decided it was time to act. He took out his phone, but found that there was no signal. It was no longer a joke. He went to the front desk, but there was no one there. However, there was an old folder on the table. When he opened it, he saw the photos. These were people he had never seen before. They were all standing in front of the door of the third room. On the back of one of the photos was the inscription, "The Last Guest." He didn't even have time to turn around when he felt someone put a hand on his shoulder. Alex had driven a few miles away from the motel, but his hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. The words on the note found in the back seat sounded like an echo in his head: "You can't leave." He felt trapped, despite the fact that the car was speeding along a deserted highway. Intuition told him that this was far from the end. Something dark and inexplicable was following him. The headlights illuminated the road, but the surroundings seemed eerily still. No other cars, no lights from houses or shops. It was as if the whole world was frozen, watching his attempt to escape. On the side of the highway, he noticed a roadside cafe with a flashing neon sign. Alex decided to stop, not so much because of hunger, but because of the need to be among people, to feel that he was not alone in this frightening night. After parking the car, he looked around. The cafe looked shabby, with cracked windows and peeling paint on the walls. But the light inside was warm, and the smell of coffee and roast meat was slightly soothing. He entered, nervously scanning the room. There were 3 customers inside: an elderly woman knitting, a middle-aged man in work clothes who looked suspiciously at the newcomer, and a young girl with bright red hair leafing through a magazine. Behind the counter stood a sullen cook with an apron stained with grease. Alex sat at the farthest table, so that he could see the entrance. He felt paranoid, but there was nothing he could do about it. After ordering coffee, he thought about what had happened. A red-haired girl walked by, stopping next to her for a second. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked with a slight grin. Alex forced a nervous smile. "You could say that." The girl nodded, clearly interested in his condition, but did not ask any more questions. She returned to her table, but while Alex was drinking coffee, he could feel her eyes on him. Suddenly, the door of the cafe opened with a bang, and a man entered the room. His clothes were dirty and his face was covered with fresh cuts. He looked like a fugitive who had just escaped from some terrible mess. The man, seeing Alex, instantly tensed up. He went straight to his table, ignoring the other customers. "You were there too, weren't you?" he asked, sinking into the chair opposite. "Where?" Alex tried to appear calm, even though his heart was pounding. "In that damn motel." The stranger's voice was shaking with rage and fear at the same time. Alex wanted to say that he didn't understand what was being said, but the man's bloodshot eyes didn't give him a chance. "I saw you leave. They won't let you go, just like they didn't let me go. You already had a note, right? This is just the beginning. They will play with you until you break down." Alex froze. The man continued, "First they send warnings. Then they start taking it away." Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Who are they? What is it?" he asked, feeling his voice tremble. The man leaned closer, his face now inches away from Alex. "The ones who stayed at the motel. You can't see them, but they're always there. You made a mistake coming back." The red-haired girl suddenly got up from her seat and walked over to their table. "I'm sorry, but both of you seem a little worried," she said, taking a quick glance at the man. "Maybe you both should exhale and stop scaring the others." But her voice was interrupted by a loud crack. The headlights of the car parked outside started flashing. Alex turned to the window, and his heart started pounding in his chest again. It was his car. But he knew that he had turned off the engine and taken the keys. Now her headlights were turning on and off rhythmically, as if someone was inside. The man in front of him paled. "They're already here," he muttered, taking off. The red-haired girl, on the other hand, looked more annoyed than scared. "Calm down, it's probably someone joking," she said, heading for the door. Alex wanted to stop her, but the words stuck in his throat. She went outside, and seconds later, the lights in the cafe flickered and went out. In the silence that followed, there was a sound, quiet but distinct. Footsteps. But their source was unclear. Alex heard the stranger start muttering to himself, and an elderly woman with knitting suddenly screamed and fell to the floor. A man in work clothes rushed to the exit, but the door through which the red-haired girl had just passed now wouldn't budge. Alex felt the cold air touch his skin. This coldness was unnatural, as if it penetrated his bones. In the darkness, he could barely make out the figures of the other customers, but the sound of footsteps was getting closer. At some point, Alex realized that they were not walking on the floor, but on the ceiling. Alex clutched the table, feeling his body tense with terror. The footsteps that sounded on the ceiling grew louder and closer. He tried to figure out what was going on, but his mind refused to accept reality. Soon the footsteps stopped, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell. Suddenly, the door that the red-haired girl had just entered opened with a loud creak. He could see her shadow appearing in the doorway. But it wasn't her. It was the man who had just been sitting across from him. His face was distorted with horror, his eyes were dilated, and his clothes were soaked with something dark and sticky, like blood. "They are. What is it?" he whispered, almost losing his voice. "You shouldn't have stayed. They know everything." Alex stepped back in horror, barely able to stand on his feet. He didn't understand what the man was talking about, but something inside was bubbling with fear. He tried to open his mouth to ask what was going on, but he couldn't make a sound. His whole body seemed to freeze, blocking any possibility of movement or speech. The man looked at him, and there was something creepy in his gaze, something empty and lifeless. He wasn't alive. It was obvious. It seemed that his soul had long since left, leaving only a shell that continued to move and speak. Suddenly, the man turned abruptly and rushed towards the door, screaming shrilly. His words sounded like something from another world. They're already coming for us. We're all dead. Alex tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't work. Fear paralyzed him, forcing him to sit rooted to the spot. He felt a chill seep into his bones, and the air around him became heavy, as if it was filled with unbearable pressure. A figure appeared from the corner where he had just been paying attention. A woman in an old-fashioned dress. She walked slowly, like a shadow, her footsteps made no noise, although other people could be heard running around in panic on the floor. She didn't look like a real person. She had no expression on her face, her eyes were empty, without a soul. Alex realized that this was not a person, but something that had captured his mind and was not going to let go. "You're from number 3, she whispered with a smile that wasn't human. She took a step forward, and the entire space around her seemed to shrink. Alex felt his soul shrink in that hazy, inhuman presence. Suddenly, the lights started flashing again, and everything was plunged into total darkness. At that moment, Alex managed to stand up, his legs seemed to come to life, but his body still couldn't be controlled. He ran to the door, trying to escape from this nightmare, but when he turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. He tried to open it again, but now it was locked. Behind him, he heard a soft but distinct sound, as if someone were quietly scratching their fingers on glass. "You can't leave," a voice said, echoing in his head. It was the same woman, but now her words sounded like a warning, as if she was talking about something inevitable. Alex turned around again. She was standing right in front of him, her face very close to his now. He felt her cold, dead gaze, which seemed to pierce right through him. She raised her hand and, without saying a word, touched his face. He felt his skin turn to stone, his body freeze, and the feeling of death filled every cell. It was as if his own life was leaving him, leaving only an empty shell. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, all that remained was to be a part of that darkness. Reality began to blur. He had lost all sense of time, consumed by this nightmare in which there was no escape. Suddenly, like a loud bang, images burst into his brain. They were fast, like flashes. The blurred faces, the walls, the endlessly repeated scenes from his life, intertwined with strangers, familiar, unfamiliar, it was an eternal gallery of the damned. Alex felt his consciousness begin to collapse, consumed by what was around him. Everything was dissolving. And then, like the last moment before the darkness swallowed him up, he realized, the motel was not just a place, but a trap. People who once stayed here disappeared, and their souls became part of something more terrible than fear itself. A place where no one was alive, and no one could leave. He felt his feet sliding on the floor, and suddenly, a door appeared in front of him. Not the one that didn't open. The door that led into the light. A faint ray pierced the darkness, and Alex felt his hands, gaining strength again, reaching for that door. But when he opened it, everything was gone. The motel. Fear. People. All. He was in a different place. On the street. In a normal world. But there was a mark on his arm. Dark, sinister. The entry in his phone, which he couldn't erase, said, "You're not alone. We are always there for you." When Alex tried to stand up, his legs wouldn't work. It was as if he was stuck in a chair, unable to get up. The silence around them was so thick that you could drown in it. The sounds of footsteps coming across the ceiling were now getting louder and clearer. He could feel the cold seeping out of every pore of his skin, as his body was literally covered in sweat. At that moment, he saw something in the corner of the room. Shadow. Vague, but clearly defined. He tensed, his breathing quickened, and his gaze stubbornly fixed on this figure. The shadow became darker, and its outline began to move slowly, as if someone were sliding along the walls. Alex tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. He gritted his teeth, trying to force himself to do something. Suddenly, the door of the cafe burst open with a bang, and a man burst into the room. He was badly battered, his clothes were torn, and his face was stained with blood. He looked at Alex with desperate fear in his eyes, his face distorted with pain. "You shouldn't have come in here," he whispered, rolling to his feet with difficulty. "They keep an eye on everyone who comes here. And now you're in their network. You're next." Alex tried to stand up, but his body was paralyzed. The man, without waiting for an answer, abruptly walked up to the counter and grabbed a bottle with something dark, like ink. He drank it in one gulp, and then his gaze became blank, detached. The man turned and headed for the door, as if under hypnosis. That's when Alex realized he wasn't the only one who was here against his will. "This person is the last guest mentioned in the folder at the reception desk. He was one of those who couldn't leave, who was trapped in this place." With each step, the man became more pale, and his movements became more unnatural. Alex felt his own body finding its strength again. He got up and ran to the door, not knowing what was waiting for him behind it. He ran outside, and the cold wind met him with a brutal thud. He rushed to his car, hoping that he would be able to get out. But as soon as he touched the door, he felt a strange vibration under his hands. The car stood as if not moving, as if frozen in time. Alex turned around, trying to figure out what was going on. And then he saw her, the woman in the old-fashioned dress who had appeared at the motel window. She was standing at the edge of the road, looking straight at him, her eyes glassy, empty. She took a step forward, and with each step, her figure became more and more of a blur, as if she didn't exist at all. But Alex couldn't look away. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his heart, and at the last moment he realized that he could not avoid what was about to happen. The woman froze right in front of him, her lips moving, uttering only one word. "It's too late." Alex stood in the middle of the street, his mind seemed to go blank. "Everything that was happening seemed so alien, unreal, that my thoughts were confused." He wanted to run away, but he didn't know where to go. He could feel his pulse speeding up, and that strange woman's voice was spinning in his head again, "It's too late." And that's when he realized, this is not an accident. Everything that happened in this place was part of some kind of plan. And he seemed to be just his pawn. Suddenly, there was a dull sound like thunder. The ground shook under his feet. Alex instinctively closed his eyes, but after a few moments he opened them again. Everything was covered with thick, yellow smoke. The sky, already dim, darkened even more. When he looked back, the motel was engulfed in flames. The building was literally cracking from the explosions, the walls were collapsing, crumbling into fiery clouds. Alex could feel the heat, even though he was a considerable distance away. He tried to figure out what was going on, but everything was happening too fast, too chaotically. The explosion was the result of Alex not knowing, or maybe not wanting to know. This place was not just an abandoned motel, it was a refuge for those who took psychotropic drugs, for those who were under control. The building was an entire laboratory, hidden from the world, a place where experiments with consciousness were conducted. All this time, he was taking pills that were slipped to him under the guise of ordinary drugs. But in reality, they were part of the control, part of the game they were playing with him. Psychotropic substances altered his perception, creating illusions and manipulating his mind. Everything he saw, the woman, the murders, the strange events, was the result of manipulation of his mind. He stood on the edge of a collapsed world, and his thoughts seemed to merge into one empty space. A state of apathy gripped him, and despite the flames, smoke, and destruction, he felt strangely cold. Everything was predictable. Everything he had been through didn't matter now. "I don't care," he whispered to himself in response to the threatening fiery flashes. His gaze dimmed, and he stepped forward, towards the disappearing horizon, into the abyss where no one could find him. Alex wasn't worried anymore. He realized that everything that had happened was just the end of his own illusions. The exploded building, psychotropic pills, the woman in the window, these were all just fragments of an empty world that could no longer captivate him. As Alex walked, seemingly exhausted, tired of everything that was happening, his steps became slower and slower, and his gaze dimmed. He didn't notice the silhouettes appearing in his path. The world around him was disappearing, as if he was in some kind of nightmare that couldn't end. He stopped trying to make sense of what was happening. He didn't care. But suddenly, from the depths of the fog, there was a sharp sound. It took him a while, but he soon realized that these were footsteps, someone else's footsteps. He turned, barely catching sight of a figure standing in the darkness. He froze, but it was too late. The dull sound of a gunshot pierced the air, and Alex felt the bullet pierce his body. The pain was searing, unbearable. He didn't even have time to realize what had happened. His body seemed frozen at the moment when he was already falling. Fragmentary thoughts flashed through my head, but my consciousness quickly clouded over, and the last sounds became strangely quiet and muffled. Death himself closed his eyes with a quick, merciless blow. His last breath escaped with difficulty, and the world around him was swallowed by darkness. Whoever fired the shot didn't show up, didn't leave a trace. He just disappeared into the void, like everything Alex had ever known. The building that exploded continued to burn, but it no longer meant anything to him. A dark world full of manipulation and fear engulfed him, leaving no memory, no hope of salvation. Jason was driving along an abandoned highway. The night was dark, and the rain was pounding on the roof of his old sedan. The radio barely picked up the signal, and the silence in the cabin became more and more depressing. He hadn't seen a single car in the last 2 hours, and the fuel gauge was slowly creeping down. He knew that if he couldn't find a gas station or a motel, he would spend the night in a car in the middle of the desert. When the neon sign of the Traveler's Paradise Motel appeared in the distance, Jason felt relieved. This place looked old-fashioned, but for the tired driver it seemed like a real salvation. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of rusty cars that looked like they'd been there for decades. There was a strange silence inside the motel. The reception desk was shabby, with a worn, jangling bell. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with gray hair and cold eyes, was sitting at the counter, writing something in a journal. "Good evening. I need a room for one night," Jason said, putting his credit card on the counter. "Number 8. Second floor," the receptionist replied shortly, handing him a key with a faded keychain. His eyes met Jason's for a second, and he added, "There's no elevator, the stairs are on the right." As Jason climbed the stairs, he noticed a strange detail. The stairs creaked, as if someone had recently passed through here, even though the area was empty. The hallway on the second floor was narrow, and the walls seemed to absorb the sounds. Every step echoed hollowly, as if someone was following him. Room 8 looked standard, a bed with a sagging mattress, a bedside table with a telephone and a small TV. Jason threw his bag on the bed and decided to take a shower. The bathroom was old, with peeling paint on the walls and a cracked mirror. When he closed the door, he noticed the words scratched on the back of it. "Don't leave the lights off." This inscription caused him an unpleasant feeling, but he attributed it to teenagers who might have stayed here before. After the shower, he lay down on the bed and turned on the TV. There was local news. The host was talking about a series of murders in the area, but Jason didn't think much of it until he heard. The last incident occurred at a motel on Route 47. The police found the body of a man in room 8. Jason froze. This was the room where he was currently staying. He turned off the TV, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. It seemed to him that something was moving outside the room. He got up and cautiously approached the door, listening. Through the crack under the door, he noticed a shadow moving back and forth. Jason squeezed the door handle, but didn't open it. Instead, he returned to the bed and tried to calm down. "It's just a motel employee or a neighbor," he thought. That night, Jason woke up to a strange sound. It was a rattling sound coming from the closet. He turned on the light and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, there was nothing inside except an old coat, but the screeching stopped. He lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come anymore. Suddenly he heard a whisper. Someone was talking right at the door. "You're next." Jason jumped up, grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, but the connection was immediately cut off. At that moment, the door of the room began to slowly open. A man in dirty clothes stood on the threshold, his face was stained with blood, and he was holding a knife in his hand. Jason rushed to the window, trying to open it, but the frames were boarded up. The stranger stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "This place, it chooses who stays," he whispered, approaching. In desperation, Jason grabbed a desk lamp and hit the man on the head. The stranger fell, but after a second he began to get up, as if the blow had not hit him. Jason ran out of the room, but the hallway was darker than before. He ran up the stairs, but instead of exiting, he found himself in another corridor. All the doors around him were closed, and there were traces of blood on some of them. He stopped at one of the doors from which the screams could be heard. When he opened it, he saw a woman tied up on a chair. There were deep cuts on her face. "Help me," she whispered. Before Jason could approach, the same man with a knife appeared around the corner. "You're not leaving here, and neither is she," he said, lunging at Jason. Jason desperately closed the door, holding it with his whole body. He understood that there was only one way out, to fight or die. Jason held the door fiercely, feeling the man on the other side trying his best to kick it down. His breathing quickened, and his hands were shaking, but he gathered the last of his strength and, loosening his grip, abruptly opened the door, hoping for a surprise. The attacker lost his balance and stumbled into the room. Jason wasted no time. He grabbed a nearby chair and hit it on the man's head. There was a dull crunch, and he fell, frozen. The woman in the chair began to cry softly. "We don't have much time. They'll be back," she whispered. "Who are they?" Jason asked, cutting the ropes that bound her. "The staff at this motel. They're not human. They catch people like you, leave us here to disappear." Her words sounded crazy, but Jason couldn't afford to doubt them. Something was really wrong with this place. As soon as he released the woman, the sound of heavy footsteps came from the hallway. She grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the window. "This is the only way," she said, pointing to a narrow fire escape. "It's boarded up," Jason objected, remembering his attempt to escape. "No, it's their trick. Try again." He pushed the frame with all his might, and the boards on the window suddenly gave way. The woman was the first to climb the stairs, followed by Jason. When they were outside, an icy wind hit them in the face. The stairs stretched down, but each step creaked so loudly that it seemed to wake up the whole motel. Halfway down, the fire exit door burst open with a bang, and two figures ran out. They were a man and a woman in staff uniforms. They had hammers in their hands. "Run! Stop it!" the woman screamed, accelerating her descent. Jason followed her, but the ladder suddenly creaked and broke. He managed to grab the edge, hanging on by his hands. A muddy area with broken concrete was waiting for him at the bottom. The woman turned around, but instead of helping, she screamed. "They're getting close." With the last of his strength, Jason pulled himself up and found himself back on the narrow metal frame. It was impossible to descend now. There was only one way to the roof of the neighboring building. "Jump!" A woman who was already standing on the roof shouted. Jason, without hesitation, ran and jumped. The blow was hard, but he survived. When he got up, the woman was already stepping back, looking somewhere behind him. "What have you done?" "What is it?" she whispered. Jason turned around and saw the motel receptionist standing on the edge of the roof. He was calm, as if being here was part of his plan. "Do you think this is the end?" "This is just the beginning," he said, and a strange smile appeared on his face. The woman grabbed Jason by the arm and dragged him to the edge of the roof, where there was a rope ladder. "Come down. Faster." As soon as they started to descend, the roof began to shake. The administrator, along with 2 other pursuers, was approaching, but the stairs were too long. They didn't make it. When Jason and the woman were on the ground, they ran towards the highway. This time they were lucky. The headlights of a truck flashed in the distance. They ran out onto the road, waving their arms. The truck stopped. "What's going on here?" the driver asked, clearly frightened by their appearance. "We need help. Get out of here," Jason shouted, jumping into the cockpit. When the truck started moving, they looked back. The Traveler's Paradise Motel disappeared into the darkness as if it had never existed. Jason thought the nightmare was over, but the woman next to him whispered, "They'll find us. They always do." The truck sped down the highway, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness. There was a tense silence in the cabin. The driver, an elderly man with a wrinkled face and a cigarette in his mouth, kept casting wary glances at Jason and the woman. "You look like you've escaped death. Who's chasing you?" "I'm sorry," he muttered. Jason looked at the woman, not knowing what to say. She beat him to it. The gang. They wanted to rob us. We barely left." "A gang?" The driver narrowed his eyes. "I've been driving here for 20 years, I haven't seen any gangs here." "It's true," Jason added, trying to sound convincing. "They're hiding." The driver snorted, but didn't say anything else. The car sped off, leaving the motel and everything that had happened there behind. An hour later, the woman suddenly grabbed Jason by the arm. "Do you hear that?" "What is it?" she whispered. Jason listened, but apart from the hum of the engine, he heard nothing. "What?" "They're watching. I'm sure." "Come on," Jason tried to reassure her, even though he could feel the anxiety starting to rise inside. The driver turned off the engine, stopping the truck at an old diner on the side of the road. "I need to rest." "And you too. You look like you're about to fall." The diner was barely lit, and the neon letters on the sign were flashing, creating an ominous atmosphere. There was no one inside except for a tired-faced waitress and a couple of customers. "Sit here, I'll be back soon," the driver said and walked away towards the toilets. Jason sat down at a table, looking around. The woman remained standing at the door, warily studying the street through the glass. "You know this isn't the end," she said suddenly, without turning around. "What are you talking about?" "They won't stop. We broke their rules. You know how that sounds, right?" Jason began, but stopped when he noticed a shadow flickering outside the window. "Listen to me," the woman turned sharply, her face contorted with fear. "They're not human. They're like machines. They know where we're going." The door of the diner creaked open, and 2 men in gray jackets entered the room. They looked like ordinary visitors, but their cold gazes clung to every detail. "Hush," the woman whispered, retreating to the counter. The waitress approached Jason with a notebook, but instead of asking about the order, she leaned closer and whispered, "Are you from there too?" Jason stared at her, dumbfounded. "What? A motel? Are you from there?" He nodded, not knowing what to say. The waitress quickly put a napkin on the table, on which it was written, "Do not go outside. They're already here." Jason felt a lump of fear rise in his throat. "We have to leave," the woman whispered, grabbing his arm. But at that moment, one of the men in the gray jacket turned his head in their direction and froze. "They've spotted us," she whispered. The man got up from the table and moved towards them. Jason jumped up, grabbing the woman by the hand, and together they ran to the door. But the second man was already standing in the way, blocking the exit. "Over here!" the waitress shouted, pointing at the back door. They rushed there, feeling their pursuers literally breathing down their backs. The back door led them into a narrow alley. The driver's car was still in place, but when Jason and the woman ran up to the cab, the driver was already dead, his body mutilated beyond recognition. "Damn it!" Jason cursed, looking around. "They're very close." A woman shouted, and at that moment men in gray jackets appeared from the alley. Without thinking, Jason started the truck. The engine roared, and he hit the gas. The wheels spun, kicking up gravel, and the car took off, almost knocking over one of the pursuers. "What now?" "Stop it," he shouted, turning to the woman. "We have to find a place where they can't find us." "But there are almost no such places left," she replied, squeezing into the seat. The truck sped along the highway, immersed in the absolute silence of the night. Jason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing briefly at the woman, who was now holding a knife taken from the cockpit and peering intently into the side mirrors. "What makes you so sure they won't leave?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to collect his thoughts. "You don't understand who we're messing with. These are not just people. They're..." She paused, looking at the headlights ahead. "Stop it." Jason slammed on the brakes. A police car was parked on the road with its flashing lights on. The silhouette of a uniformed officer got out of the car and raised his hand, signaling to stop. "We're lucky," Jason muttered, rolling down the window. But the woman abruptly grabbed his hand, squeezing it with force. "No. Don't say anything." The officer came closer, his face was hidden under his cap, and his voice sounded too monotonous. "Good evening. Have you violated something?" "No, officer, it's just..." Jason began, but suddenly noticed that the badge on the policeman's uniform was missing. The woman pushed open the door on the other side of the cabin and ran out, disappearing into the darkness. "Hey!" Jason shouted, trying to stop her. The policeman, ignoring her escape, continued to stare at Jason. "You need to go back. It's safer there," he said in a cold, lifeless voice. Jason felt cold sweat trickle down his back. It wasn't a policeman. Suddenly, the officer reached for his holster, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a knife with a long curved blade. Jason didn't wait. He pressed the gas pedal all the way down, overtaking the figure of the policeman, who did not even try to jump to the side. The truck took off onto a deserted country road, the headlights illuminating only a narrow lane ahead. Jason had barely turned when the figure of a woman appeared in front of him. "Are you crazy?" "Stop it," he shouted, stopping. She looked scared, but tough. Her fingers were still clutching the same knife. "It's not over, Jason. We found the worst place to be. Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "Because now we have no choice," she whispered, nodding at the gloomy figure standing on the hill ahead. For a moment, it seemed like it was just another stalker. But Jason noticed the details, a knife dripping with something dark, tattered clothes, and a face full of calmness. The woman suddenly turned pale. "That's him." "Who is he?" "A maniac. They work for him. This is their leader." Before Jason could understand anything, the man on the hill raised his hand. Other figures began approaching the truck from different directions, men and women in gray jackets, armed with knives and crowbars. "Damn it! Get in the car." The woman rushed back into the cab, and Jason hit the gas again, driving a few meters away from the figure on the hill. "Are you sure this isn't the end?" "Stop it," he shouted, as an eerie hum of voices sounded behind them, as if it were an alarm for their death. "They won't stop until they get what they want." "And what is it?" She looked at him in silence, and Jason suddenly realized that he would never know the truth. Ahead, the road split. One path led back to the highway, the other into a dense forest. "Which way?" "Into the woods," she said. "They hate the forest." Jason didn't understand why, but he obeyed. The truck flew into the narrow road, cutting through bushes and branches that whipped against the windows. But they weren't alone. From behind, in the headlights, he could see their silhouettes, dozens of figures racing after them at superhuman speed. Jason could feel his heart pounding with panic. The woman in the cab next to him pressed herself against the door, as if she was going to jump out at any moment, but she held on. "Who are they?" His voice was shaking, but his gaze was focused on the road, on every pothole that could send them into a ditch. "Do you really want to know? Or do you want to survive?" The woman looked at him from under her brows. The truck flew onto a forest road, the trees closed over them in a dense corridor through which the moonlight barely penetrated. The headlights picked out bushes and driftwood, but something was moving ahead. "Damn it!" Jason swerved sharply, feeling the rear wheels start to slip. A man stood in front with a crowbar in his hands. Without moving, he just waited for the truck to crash. Jason pulled the car back onto the road, narrowly missing him, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The man didn't even move, as if he knew they would come back. "They're just playing with us," the woman muttered, clutching the knife. "Who are they?" Jason shouted again, his voice cracking. "The people who pay for these motels. Those who wait for people like us." "What are you talking about?" She closed her eyes, as if she was going to tell something that had been hiding inside for a long time. "These places. These are not just motels. These are traps. And everyone who goes there becomes a part of the game." "Games? Are you kidding? Listen up." She grabbed his arm. "Did you see how this policeman didn't even dodge? How did those figures stand as if they were waiting for us? These are not random people, they are organized." "Who organized them?" She was silent. At that moment, there was a loud crack. The branches ahead broke under the pressure of something heavy. Jason slammed on the brakes. A truck was parked in front of them. His cabin was empty, but the engine was running. "It's them," the woman whispered, her face turning white. "They what?" She opened the door and ran into the woods, leaving him alone. Jason didn't know what to do. He looked at the abandoned truck, at the headlights that blinded him, and felt something around him becoming unbearably quiet. Suddenly, a man came out from behind the truck. His face was expressionless, and he was wearing a work uniform. But there was something strange about his movements, slow but purposeful. Jason didn't wait. He turned his truck around, intending to brake back onto the highway. But the road was blocked. 4 cars were parked bumper to bumper, blocking the way. "Damn it!" Jason slammed on the steering wheel. He opened the cabin door and ran into the woods. Branches whipped at his face, and his feet slid on the damp ground. He could hear footsteps behind him. Someone was chasing him, but he didn't look back. After a few minutes of running, he came across a house. It was a small wooden cottage, covered with moss and almost merging into the forest. Jason stormed inside, slamming the door behind him. "Help me!" "Stop it!" he shouted, but there was nothing inside. The room looked abandoned. Dust covered the furniture, and torn newspapers littered the floor. He walked over to the table where the notebook was lying. Opening it, Jason began to read. "If you're here, it's too late. They won't stop. These are not people. This is..." Then the text was torn up, as if someone had torn out the page in a hurry. Suddenly, there was a creak of floorboards. Jason whirled around. "Who's there?" His voice was trembling. A figure appeared in the shadow of the doorway. She took a step forward, and Jason recognized the woman. "You left me." He shouted, but her face was different. Empty. She raised the knife. It's the only way out, she whispered. Jason froze, his breathing coming in short gasps. The woman in front of him held a knife as if it was the only tool capable of ending their agony. What are you doing? He croaked, trying to hold her gaze. You don't understand. Her voice became emotionless, her eyes empty. They'll never let us go. There was a soft creaking sound from behind, as if someone had walked across the floor behind him. Jason turned around, but saw no one. Who's here? The voice betrayed him, trembling in the silence. It doesn't matter, the woman slowly came closer, the knife still in her hands. Only one thing is important, we are already a part of it. What? Jason shouted, stepping back until his back hit the wall. What's going on? She looked at him, and tears glistened in her eyes. We're the next story, she whispered, and her lips twitched as if she couldn't believe her own words. At that moment, all the doors in the house abruptly flew open. A draft filled the room, blowing newspapers off the floor. Jason turned around, his eyes searching for a way out, but there was only silence. The woman took another step forward. You can run if you want. But remember, they already know your name. Jason rushed to the door, his legs barely obeying him. He flew out into the street and ran deep into the forest, not understanding the road. Every branch, every rustle seemed like the sounds of a chase. He ran until he was on the road. He saw headlights in the distance. The car. Hope flared up inside him, and he waved his arms, running out into the middle of the road. The car stopped. The driver slowly opened the window. Are you okay? The man asked, his voice calm. Jason, covered in dirt and wounds, leaned against the car door. Help me. I'm being hunted. The man nodded, took out a bottle of water from the glove compartment and handed it to Jason. Get in, I'll drive you. Jason collapsed into the passenger seat, his head falling against the back. He could feel the adrenaline gradually leaving his body. Thanks, he muttered, looking out the window. The car started moving. But after a few minutes, Jason noticed that the road looked familiar. Too familiar. Where are we going? What is it? He asked, trying to keep calm. The man looked at him for a moment, and Jason saw a cold, emotionless expression in his eyes. To where you need to be, he replied, turning onto the very forest road that started it all. The truck stopped at a familiar motel. The lights were on in the windows. The car door locked with a distinctive click. Got a job at one of the branches of a huge supermarket chain. He had just moved to a new city, leaving behind everything, friends, relatives, and a past life. Walmart seemed to him the perfect place to start. Shifts here started late at night and lasted until dawn, but, as the manager said, it was the quietest part of the day, there were few visitors, the work was almost always routine. The first days passed quietly. The store was living its usual life, customers were rummaging through the shelves, one of the employees was filling the shelves, and everything in the warehouse was boiling with constant unloading. Kevin quickly settled in, became friends with a guy named Todd and a girl named Sam, who also worked night shifts. But he soon noticed that the night shift wasn't as quiet as it seemed at first glance. There was always a strange smell in the hall. Somewhere in the far corner, among the shelves of discounted goods, there was a heavy, musty aroma. No one paid any attention to this, although Kevin noticed more than once how some employees winced as they passed by. You'll get used to it, Todd said one day, when he noticed Kevin pausing at the very corner. We have an old warehouse here, sometimes something goes bad there. Kevin nodded, but the strange feeling wouldn't let go. In the third week of work, he received a task, to help Sam sort out a batch of goods that arrived at the store in the afternoon. It meant going to a warehouse that he had only glimpsed before. The warehouse turned out to be completely different from what he had imagined. Instead of neat rows of boxes, this place looked like a real maze: narrow passageways, piles of pallets, the light from dim lamps that barely penetrated through the layers of dust. Cardboard boxes, pieces of film, and even some rags were scattered on the floor. "Welcome to chaos," Sam laughed, noticing his confused look. "It's better not to get lost here." She quickly pointed to two large boxes labeled "Preponderance to the Third Zone" and explained where they needed to be moved. When Kevin pulled the first box, he felt something inside it pumping strangely, like liquid. "What's that?" "What is it?" he asked, glancing at Sam. "Don't even think about opening it." Last month, Todd opened one of these boxes, and it turned out that it was frozen meat that had thawed and rancid. "Do you want to know what the smell was?" Kevin shook his head, continuing to pull the box. But the thought that there could be anything in such boxes bothered him. The next night, Kevin stayed at work later than usual. One of the colleagues did not come on shift, and he had to finish some of the work alone. The store was empty. Only the humming of the refrigerators broke the silence. When he entered the storage area, he thought he heard a sound. Quiet, muffled, like a rustle or someone's footsteps. He stopped and listened, but he didn't hear anything else. Deciding that they were just rats, he continued his work. But after a few minutes, the rustling was repeated. Now it was coming from the back of the warehouse, from a section where employees rarely entered. Kevin froze. "Hey! Is anyone there?" His voice echoed loudly. There was no response. Kevin decided to check it out. When he reached the far corner, he felt a chill. Even the air seemed different here, heavy, dense. There was practically no lighting, only a faint glow from the lamps at the beginning of the corridor helped to distinguish the outlines of the boxes. And then he saw the door. It was half open, and there was darkness behind it. Kevin reached for the door, but suddenly he heard a sound that made him stop. It was a thud, like something hitting a metal floor. He took a step back. Something inside him told him that it was better to turn around and leave. But curiosity got the better of him. Kevin went inside. There was another warehouse behind the door. This room was smaller than the main one, but it was a complete mess. Broken boxes, some metal parts and scraps of paper were scattered on the floor. Kevin noticed that the smell he had smelled in the gym had intensified to the point of nausea. The light was even dimmer than in the previous room. The single lamp hanging from the ceiling flickered, creating an eerie play of shadows. Kevin noticed strange stains on the floor. They looked like traces of something sticky. The spots stretched to the far corner of the room, where there were huge metal containers. Maybe it's just spoiled food, Kevin tried to reassure himself. He took a step forward, trying not to make any noise. It seemed to him that he was alone, but the feeling that someone was watching him did not let go. As he approached the first container, he noticed that there was something like a serial number stamped on its lid. However, there were also deep scratches on the metal, as if someone had tried to open it manually. He walked around the container and saw another one. This time, the lid was ajar. Kevin froze, trying to see what was inside. As soon as he looked inside, there was a loud crash from behind. He whirled around, his heart almost jumping out of his chest. "Todd? Sam? It's you?" "Stop it," he shouted, but there was no answer. The crash was repeated. This time the sound came from somewhere behind the shelves. Kevin glanced at the container and saw that there was some dirty cloth inside. From the outside, it looked like ordinary trash, but something in its depth seemed wrong. Not wanting to stay here any longer, he decided to leave the warehouse. But when he turned around, his eyes stopped on the wall. There, among the scraps of paper, was an old plaque. It said, "Recycling Department. Access is for authorized personnel only." Next to the sign, he noticed a note taped to the wall. The paper was tattered, and the text was barely legible. Kevin held out his hand and read. Don't stay at night. Keep the door closed. If the container has been opened, inform the manager. At that moment, the lights in the room flickered, and Kevin noticed movement in the shadows. Who's there? Stop it, he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. Again, there was no response. Kevin decided to run. He rushed back to the door, but it wasn't there. Where the exit had been, there was now a bare wall. He froze, looking around for another way. But the warehouse, which seemed so simple a minute ago, has turned into a real maze. Footsteps. This time they were very close. Kevin turned around and saw that someone was standing between the containers. The figure was indistinct, hidden in the semi-darkness, but the way it moved was enough for Kevin. It wasn't a man. He ran, not understanding the road. Boxes and pallets fell under his feet, he almost fell several times, but adrenaline kept him moving. When he reached the end of the warehouse, he saw the door again. It looked old, like everything else here, but it was ajar. Without thinking for a second, he rushed to it and opened it. The main room of the store was behind the door. It looked as if nothing had happened. Kevin looked around, panting. The store was empty. Todd. Sam, he shouted. But instead of answering, he heard a strange sound. It was coming from the loudspeakers installed throughout the store. It was a creaking sound, like someone moving something heavy on the floor. Then a voice sounded. Dull, monotonous. All employees must leave the building immediately. Kevin rushed to the exit. When he reached the front doors, they did not open. At this time, the lights in the store began to go out. The lights went out completely. Kevin was left alone in the pitch darkness. Panic rolled over him like a wave, but he tried to keep at least some sanity. By touch, he began to make his way along the wall in search of at least some kind of exit. Footsteps. Heavy, thudding footsteps began to sound behind him. They were unhurried, but every second of them made Kevin's heart clench with horror. Who's there? Kevin's voice faltered, but he tried to sound confident. There was no answer again, but the footsteps were getting closer. At that moment, his fingers came across something smooth and cold glass. It was one of the storefronts. Kevin remembered that he had a phone in his pocket. With shaking hands, he pulled it out and turned on the flashlight. A ray of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a showcase filled with boxes. The footsteps suddenly stopped. Kevin turned, illuminating the space behind him. No one. He froze, trying to catch at least some movement or sound. Silence. Oppressive, absolute silence. And then he heard a whisper. Quiet, barely discernible. It was coming from somewhere above, as if from loudspeakers. Why are you here? The words were clear but unnatural, as if they had been recorded and played back on an old tape. I'm just a security guard. I do not know what is going on. Kevin shouted, his voice echoing through the empty store. The whispering stopped. But suddenly, something moved behind him. He turned around, pointing the flashlight at the source of the sound. One of the huge trolleys that were used to move goods was slowly rolling down the aisle, as if someone invisible was pushing it. Kevin stepped back, but then noticed that something was hanging on the handle of the cart. It was an old Walmart employee's uniform. There was something glistening in his jacket pocket. Gathering his strength, he came closer. The fabric was dusty and smelled of something rotten. Kevin took out a small object from his pocket. It was a badge. There was a name on it. John Harper. Employee of the Month. He saw a scrawled text on the back of the badge. They're watching you. Don't trust the exit. Kevin dropped his badge and jumped back. His breathing became erratic, and his heart was racing. And then he realized that he was hearing footsteps again. This time they sounded from two sides. The phone's light flickered and then suddenly went out. Hell, no, no. Kevin frantically tried to turn on the flashlight, but the phone screen remained black. In the darkness, the footsteps continued to approach. They sounded louder and louder, and then abruptly stopped. Kevin felt the cold air on his neck, as if someone was standing right behind him. He didn't turn around. Instead, he rushed forward, blindly trying to find a way out. His legs stumbled, he bumped into shelves and boxes, but he did not stop. And then a faint light appeared in front of him. It was a service exit. The door was ajar, and dim lamplight could be seen behind it. Without thinking, Kevin rushed to the door. He flew into it, tripping and falling to the concrete floor. The light blinded him, and he could finally see where he was. It was a long hallway with many doors on both sides. There was another note on the floor. It said, "You opened the door. Now everything will begin." Kevin got to his feet, breathing heavily, and looked around. The hallway was narrow, the walls were painted gray, and the ceiling was covered with peeling plaster. The light came from old lamps that hung on rusty chains. Some of them flickered, making a barely audible crackle, giving the place an even more sinister appearance. He picked up the note, trying to find some clue in it. The paper was damp, as if someone had recently held it with wet hands. "You opened the door. Now it all starts." The words stuck in his mind like a warning, but they didn't explain anything. Kevin moved away from the door, leaving it open, and began to move down the hallway. The air here was stale, reminiscent of the smell of an old basement. As he passed one of the doors, he noticed that it had no handle. The wooden surface was riddled with deep scratches, as if someone was trying to get out from inside. "What the hell?" he muttered, cautiously backing away from the door. He kept moving forward, looking back all the time. His footsteps echoed dully, giving the feeling that someone was walking behind him. After a few minutes, he reached the end of the corridor, where there was another door. This time it looked massive, made of metal, with a small window at the top. Kevin looked into it. There was a small room behind the door. There was a table in the center, and an object was lying on it. It looked like an old dictaphone. There were cameras in the corners of the room, pointing at the table, and the red lights of their work were flashing, creating an eerie atmosphere. Kevin slowly opened the door. The hinges creaked, breaking the silence that weighed on my ears. When he entered, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening sound, as if someone had pushed it from the inside. "Hey! Stop it!" he shouted, turning around, but he saw no one. The recorder on the table flashed green, as if inviting him to turn on the recording. Kevin's hand involuntarily reached for the play button. Click. A voice, old and hoarse, came from the speaker. "If you're listening to this, it means you've already gone too far. This store is not just a place. It's a trap that you locked yourself from the inside." Kevin tensed up. The voice continued. "Did you notice the doors without handles? Did you notice the cameras? It's all part of the game. We're watching you, and you won't be able to leave until you finish it." He felt cold sweat trickle down his back. "A game? What kind of game?" he whispered, looking around the room. The recorder was silent for a few seconds, and then the voice added, "Find the answers or find your death. Good luck." There was another click, and the recording stopped. Kevin looked around the table, trembling. There was another object under the recorder, a small map. It showed a schematic representation of the floor plan. Several rooms were marked in red. "This can't be real," he muttered. But at that moment, the light in the room flickered, and rapid footsteps were heard in the hallway. Kevin ran out the door and pressed himself against the wall, trying to be inconspicuous. The footsteps grew louder. They were fast, chaotic, as if someone was running in a panic. A figure flashed by in front of him. It was a man dressed in the same guard uniform as his own. Only this man's face looked distorted, his eyes were bulging, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. The figure disappeared around a bend, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Kevin realized that there might be no way out of this game. But what did the red marks on the map mean? He ran down the hallway, checking the plan. His legs were aching with fatigue, but fear drove him forward. Soon, he found one of the marked rooms. The door was ajar. Behind it was a storeroom full of shelves with goods. On one of the shelves was a box tied with a rope. Kevin walked over to her and untied the rope. Inside, he found an old photo album. Each photo showed the store's employees. But their faces, they were crossed out with a red marker. He saw his picture on the last page. It was taken recently, maybe today. The face in the photo was also crossed out. Kevin, horrified, dropped the album. At that moment, the pantry doors slammed shut. "No! Let me out! Stop it!" he shouted, rushing to the door. Voices were heard outside. They were speaking at the same time, in different languages, but the general meaning was clear. "You're next." Kevin felt his breathing slow down, as if the air had become thicker and time was beginning to stretch out. He didn't take his eyes off the album lying on the floor. His picture with the red cross on his face was the last straw in a series of events. This is no longer an accident, not a coincidence. It's something more, something purposeful. He quickly got up from the floor, gathering his remaining calm. His gaze fell on the map, which he was still clutching in his hand. There are a few marked rooms left. Wasting no time, he went out into the hallway, full of flickering light and a growing sense of persecution. "All this, it has to be explained by logic," he whispered, trying to convince himself. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each sound seeming louder than it should be. The lights were flashing more and more often, and somewhere far away there was a barely perceptible noise, as if someone was moving heavy objects. The next room was very close. The door was closed, but there was a sign on it, Warehouse 17. At first glance, there is nothing unusual, except that there should be no warehouses with numbers higher than 10 in the building. Kevin slowly opened the door. It was dark inside, with only a faint light from the hallway illuminating the first few steps. Cardboard boxes, torn packages, and some old things were scattered on the floor. Something glittered in the depths of the room. He entered, trying not to make any noise. The dim light of the flashlight illuminated a metal cabinet on which was engraved the inscription, "Nothing personal, only rules." Rules? What the hell are the rules? He exhaled, slowly coming closer. There was a piece of paper on the cabinet. Kevin took it, trying to ignore how the cold metal seemed to stick to his fingers. Lines of text similar to instructions were printed on the paper. "Don't go where you're not invited. Don't try to figure out what's going on. Don't look for the guilty. If you see familiar faces, it's not them. Leave when you can." The last line was written in red pen. "You're late." Kevin's heart sank. What does it mean? Who left these rules? He glanced behind him, feeling the cold air pass over his neck. The hallway was empty, but the feeling that he wasn't alone became almost unbearable. A sharp sound interrupted his thoughts. There was a creaking sound behind them, as if something heavy was slowly moving across the floor. Kevin turned around, shining his flashlight into the depths of the warehouse. There was something moving in the shadows. "Hey! Who's there?" His voice faltered, but he forced himself to speak anyway. There was no response. Instead, a hand emerged from the darkness. She was wearing a dirty glove, with a torn cloth revealing chafed skin. A head appeared behind her. A man dressed in a store employee's uniform was looking at him. His eyes seemed lifeless, and his face was covered with what looked like ashes. "Do you work here? Help me!" Kevin shouted. The man did not answer. Instead, he took a step forward, as if testing something. Kevin stepped back. "Hey, wait! Stop it!" he shouted, but the figure continued to move. Kevin rushed to the door, quickly slamming it behind him. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing heavily, when the sound came again, footsteps, but this time fast, hurried. They were getting closer. He ran. The floor plan in his hand was his only clue, his only hope. Kevin turned left, then right, weaving between the corridors. The footsteps did not lag behind, it seemed that they were multiplying. Ahead, he saw another marked room. The door was ajar, and light was shining through. Kevin stormed inside, slamming the door behind him. The room was strange. There were dozens of photographs on the walls. Each one showed a man in a store employee's uniform, but all the photos were old, as if they had been taken decades ago. The faces in some of the pictures were crossed out in red, while others were erased. A large photograph hung on the central wall. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a formal suit. At the bottom of the photo was a sign, "Manager of the Year, Harrison Cole." There was a dictaphone on the floor under the photo. Kevin picked it up without thinking and pressed the button. Click. The voice was low, confident. "Welcome to our family business. We don't just work here, we keep traditions alive. Those who violate them pay a price. If you're hearing this, it means you've already gone too far. Find a way out. And remember, they're always watching." The recording ended. Kevin lowered the recorder and looked at the door. An inscription slowly began to appear on it, as if someone had scratched it from the outside. "You won't make it. What should I do next?" Kevin felt fear wash over him. The inscription on the door continued to grow, as if an invisible hand was furiously carving the words deeper into the wooden surface. He took a step back, trying to find some sort of plan of action. Suddenly, the door flew open with a loud bang. But there was no corridor behind it, nor those who were chasing him. There was a warehouse there, the very warehouse where it all started. The boxes were on the floor, and light was barely coming from a broken lamp. It looked like he had made a circle. Kevin froze, feeling his breath catch in his throat. In the middle of the warehouse, in the same place where he found the album, there was another item. It was his own jacket. She was wearing a badge that he had never worn, Kevin Jensen, intern, electronics department. He lifted his jacket, hoping to find an explanation. But when he turned around, there was a man standing behind him. The one who appeared in the shadows is an employee in a dirty uniform. He was closer now, and Kevin could finally make out his face. It looked familiar. The man raised his hand, pointing at the badge. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Your shift starts." Kevin tried to step back, but felt something hard under his feet. He looked down. There was a new piece of paper on the floor. It was printed on. "Welcome to the family. Please follow the rules and remember, your life is part of our tradition." When he looked up again, the light was gone. The warehouse was plunged into absolute darkness, and the silence was broken only by slow footsteps approaching from all directions. His shout broke the silence, but there was no response. Only the warehouse doors slowly slammed shut, leaving him in a gloomy void. Later, on the morning shift, the manager walked around the store, checking the departments. Stopping at Warehouse 17, he looked around the door with a slight smile. There were barely discernible letters on its surface. Kevin. A new employee. "Welcome to Walmart," he murmured before continuing his rounds. Kevin was never seen again. The house was in perfect order, as if it had been cut out of a fashion magazine about interior design. Sunlight poured through the windows, framing the bright accents of the modern decor. Matthew and Sarah, a young married couple, moved here a few months ago to start a new life. There was enthusiasm in their eyes, the work was going well, their 2-year-old son Jake was laughing every day, and they spent the evenings with friends over wine and conversations. Sarah loved cooking, and Matthew was really passionate about gardening. Every morning, he started by checking the plants in the yard, watching the roses they had planted together, and then came home with a bouquet to put it in a vase on the kitchen table. These rituals seemed unshakable, as did their happiness. But one detail still gave Sarah a strange feeling. Basement. She rarely went there, the space was dark, dusty and served only as a storage for unnecessary things. The stairs leading down creaked with every step, and the light bulb blinked, as if warning that it was better to leave this place alone. Matthew just laughed at her concern. Basements always seem gloomy. But it's just a basement, Sarah. It's okay. It all started with the little things. At first, Sarah noticed that someone was moving things in the basement. The boxes they stacked in the corner ended up in the middle of the room. She didn't think much of it, deciding that maybe Jake was playing nearby, and then Matthew accidentally left the basement door open. "Were you looking for anything downstairs yesterday?" she asked her husband at dinner. "No. And why would I go there? All my tools are in the garage," he waved away, without taking his eyes off the plate. An unpleasant feeling settled in her chest, but she decided not to dwell on it. It's just a coincidence. After a week, Jake started acting strangely. He was looking at the stairs to the basement and saying, "Dad's there." Matthew joked that his son wanted to play hide-and-seek, but Sarah was alarmed. "Jake, did you see someone downstairs?" The kid just shook his head and giggled. One night, Sarah woke up to a crash. It seemed to her that the noise was coming from the basement. She pushed her husband. "Matt, get up. There's someone there." He got up reluctantly, picked up a baseball bat, and headed downstairs. Sarah remained waiting at the door, clutching the phone in her hands, ready to dial the police. But Matthew returned a few minutes later, shrugging his shoulders in disbelief. "Nothing. One of the boxes just fell down." "You're worrying too much." Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a few days, she decided to figure it out on her own. While Jake was sleeping and Matthew was at work, Sarah went down to the basement. She turned on the light and carefully examined the space. There were those boxes in the corner, but now there were strange scratches on them, as if someone had tried to open them. She noticed footprints on one of the walls that looked like dirty fingerprints. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a small metal hatch in the corner. She had never paid any attention to him before. She came closer and pulled the handle. The hatch was locked. That it seemed strange to her. She went upstairs, took a screwdriver, and came back to open it. The hatch led to a narrow passage ending in another door. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard that she thought she could hear it all over the basement. She slowly opened the door and found herself in a small room. There was a table with several chairs, shelves were filled with canned food and bottles of water, and there was an old mattress in the corner. Her breathing quickened. It was like a shelter. Sarah heard a faint sound. A rustle. She whirled around, but saw no one. Not wanting to stay there any longer, she hurried back upstairs, making sure everything was closed. When Matthew returned home, Sarah told him about the discovery. He stared at her for a long moment before answering. "You're just too impressionable. This is probably the old shelter of the previous owners. Don't wind yourself up." But something in his tone made her uneasy. After a week, Matthew began to avoid talking about the basement. He was working late more and more often, and Sarah felt more and more lonely. One evening, when she was putting Jake to bed, she noticed that the basement window was ajar. Sarah knew she was definitely closing it. Fear gripped her. She called the police. When the officers arrived, they thoroughly searched the house and basement, but found nothing. They only advised her to be careful. Sarah closed the front door behind the police and tried to calm down. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was still racing. She looked at Jake, who was already asleep in his crib, and was relieved to see that the baby hadn't realized something was wrong. She knew the police hadn't found anything, but she was haunted by those footprints in the basement. She couldn't explain their origin. Maybe it's just old trash. Dirt came from somewhere, or... She didn't finish, unable to complete the thought even in her mind. The next day, Sarah decided not to go down to the basement anymore. She put the key in the drawer and locked it in case Jake decided to play there. Let Matt handle it, she thought. But now the silence of the house was uncomfortable for her. Sarah began to notice that she sometimes heard footsteps, even though she was sure she was alone at home. A couple of times it seemed to her that someone was looking at her through the window. She even ran outside to check, but everything was empty. Matthew returned home later and later. He waved it off, saying that he had a difficult project at work, and asked not to worry. But Sarah sensed that he was hiding something. One evening, when she was cooking dinner, the lights suddenly went out in the house. Jake screamed from his room, and Sarah rushed to him. She hugged the baby to her, trying to convince him that everything was fine, that it was just a power outage. But she couldn't believe it herself. While she was comforting Jake, she heard a sound. A creak. Light, but tangible. It was the sound of the basement door opening. Sarah froze, her heart stopped for a moment. She slowly turned her head towards the stairs. Darkness enveloped everything, but she knew the door was locked. Sarah dialed Matthew's number. Her hands were shaking so much that the phone almost slipped out of her fingers. Matt. Where are you? She tried not to panic, but her voice betrayed her condition. I'm still at work. Is everything okay? No. The lights are out, and I can hear sounds in the house. Please come soon. Sarah, calm down. Maybe it's just an old house. I'll be there in an hour, okay? An hour? But Matt had already hung up. She hugged Jake tighter, feeling the baby tremble in her arms. She had to be strong for him. Turning on the flashlight on her phone, Sarah slowly went downstairs, heading for the basement door. She had to check if it was closed. But when Sarah reached the stairs, the door was open. She could barely keep herself from screaming. She knew she had left it closed. Unable to wait any longer, she called the police again. This time, she wasn't going to just sit around and hope for the best. When the officers arrived, they searched the basement again. One of them found the door to that hidden room and looked inside. It's really weird here, he said, surveying the space. But there's no sign of anyone here. Sarah began to doubt her own sanity more and more. She spent the whole night sitting in the kitchen, holding Jake in her arms and waiting for Matthew to return. When he returned, he looked worried. Are you sure you're not overexerting yourself? He asked. Sarah couldn't believe her ears. Are you serious? Matt, there's definitely something going on here. Maybe it's just an old house, he repeated, and she realized that she shouldn't expect any help from him. The next few days passed quietly, but Sarah remained alert. She locked all the doors, checked the windows, but the feeling of anxiety did not disappear. One night, she heard the creaking again. This time, she decided to go check it out herself. Leaving Jake asleep in his crib, she picked up a kitchen knife and headed for the basement stairs. The light was on. Someone was clearly downstairs. Sarah felt the adrenaline rush through her. She slowly descended the stairs, holding the knife in front of her. She saw fresh footprints on the floor. Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the corner of the room. Don't be afraid. She froze. The man stepped out of the shadows. His face was dirty and his eyes were cold. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, taking a step forward. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Sarah's voice was trembling. "I lived here. Before you. This is my home." She stood there, unable to move, while the man continued to speak. His tone remained calm, but there was a threat in his eyes. "You took my place. But I'm not leaving." Sarah froze, as if a cold had pierced her body. The man in front of her was covered in cuts, his skin looked inflamed, and bloodstains could be seen through the torn, damp cloth he was wrapped in. His face was disfigured, one eye was almost completely covered by a scar, and his mouth was distorted by deep wounds, as if someone had once tried to silence him forever. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "But you left me a choice. This is my home. You took it from me." Sarah slowly raised the knife, keeping her eyes on the stranger. Her voice was trembling, but she tried to speak firmly. "Go away. Immediately." The man grunted, taking another step forward. His movements were slow but deliberate, like someone who was used to being careful. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice becoming menacing. "You live on my rights. You put your things where my place should be. I warned you. I tried." Sarah thought of those strange sounds, footprints, and open doors. It was him. All this time. Her fear turned to anger. "You have no right to be here. I'll call the police," she shouted, taking a step back. The man grinned, and that smile made her shudder. It was twisted, unnatural, and his voice had become quiet and almost soothing. "You've already summoned them. What did they find?" "Nothing. They think you're going crazy. Tell me, Sarah, are you sure they'll believe you next time?" Her breathing quickened. She knew he was right. The police already considered her a hysterical woman. But it was impossible to retreat. She had to protect Jake. Gathering her strength, Sarah shouted, "Get out of here, or I'll call for help." The man seemed oblivious to her threat. He just tilted his head, examining her carefully, as if studying her fear. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said softly. "But you're forcing me." Suddenly, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the basement. Sarah rushed upstairs, slamming the door and locking it. Her hands were shaking so much that the key almost fell out of her fingers. Sarah didn't sleep a wink that night. She was sitting in Jake's room, holding a knife in her hands, and listening to every sound. She understood that this man would not leave just like that. The next day, Sarah tried to persuade Matthew to move out. She begged him, telling him about meeting a stranger, but Matt just sighed in exasperation. "Sarah, I'm tired of your stories. It's just stress. You need to rest. Maybe go to your mom's with Jake for a couple of days, and I'll figure it out." She couldn't believe that he didn't believe her. Annoyance mixed with despair. Over the next few days, the man returned again and again. He knocked on the basement door, sometimes whispering her name. His voice was low and hoarse, bone-chilling. "Sarah. Sarah, come out. I need to talk." She tried to ignore him, plugged her ears, turned on the music. But he didn't stop. One day, she was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud bang. Sarah ran to the stairs, but the basement door was in place, locked. She heard his voice from the other side. "I've been patient, Sarah. But you're not giving me a choice." Sarah felt fear envelop her again. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. "We need to act." Sarah was prepared. She replaced the locks on the doors, installed an alarm system, and even bought a can of pepper spray. She wanted this nightmare to end once and for all. That night, the man knocked on the door again. But instead of calling out to her, he began slowly knocking her out with his shoulder. Sarah sat with Jake, trembling, clutching the knife in one hand and the phone in the other. When the door started to crack, she realized she couldn't wait any longer. She called the police and screamed, "If you come in, I'll kill you. Can you hear me?" The noise stopped. There was silence for a moment. Sarah forced out her breath. But then she heard him laugh. Muffled, hoarse, coming from somewhere deep inside. "You won't do that, Sarah. You are afraid. But I'm not." Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation, the clear realization that no amount of security measures would protect her. The man wasn't just crazy, he was part of that shadow, part of that horror that she was trying to push out of her life. He was there. She heard that laugh again. Now he wasn't just deaf. He was filled with anger, almost joyous. With each raucous sigh, she found it harder to breathe. It wasn't just a man. It was something that stuck into her life and wasn't going to go away. "You can't hide from me, Sarah," he said again, and his voice seemed completely normal now, as if he were standing right outside her door. "I'm here where you can't see, and it's only going to get worse. Everything that you have built, I will destroy." Sarah raised the knife and squeezed it in her hands, her fingers squeezing around the handle, as if she wanted to tear it out of reality itself. She felt her blood run cold. His words were like a curse, like a shadow that no simple action could erase. He knew she was afraid. He knew she was alone. When she turned back to the door, she noticed her eyes boring into the footprints he had left on the floor. Blood caked in the places of his steps where his wounds touched the ground. It didn't look like the usual footprints. They were revived. Thick liquid, punctuating every scratch, as if his wounds kept opening, even in moments of silence. Suddenly, the door rattled. She couldn't stand it, the wall on which she had been trying to find support all this time cracked. He was here. The door flew in, and the man stood in the doorway, his body covered in blood, his eyes, though covered with scars, staring at her with such terrible determination that it became difficult for her to breathe. "You don't understand what you've done, Sarah," his voice was still hoarse, but now with a new, even more creepy intonation. "I warned you." Sarah dropped the knife, grabbed Jake and jumped back to the window, but the man did not give her a chance. He stepped forward, his body, despite all the wounds, moving like mechanisms twisted to the limit. He was faster than she realized. Before she could exhale, Sarah felt something cold touch her skin. His hands, black and inflamed, squeezed her shoulders. "You're not leaving, Sarah. Your steps, your attempts, it's all useless." She tried to resist, tried to pull away, but his strength was enormous. He wasn't just a man. He was something much worse. "What have you done to me?" Her words came out in a hoarse, strangled voice. You're not human." The man grinned, and his distorted face was covered in blood, as if his skin was tearing again in real time. He didn't answer. He didn't need any answers. He was too close. For a moment, she felt his fingers penetrate her shoulder, embedding themselves into her flesh. It was painful. It hurt to the point where she almost couldn't understand what was going on. "You don't believe me, Sarah. But you can already see. You see how it ends. All you wanted to do was leave. But I'll be back. I'll always come back." Sarah felt her strength waning. Fear and dread squeezed her inside. But now she had one thought, one goal: she had to survive. She couldn't let this monster take everything. She gathered her strength, remembered Jake, and felt his presence as the last anchor that held her in reality. Horrified but furious, she pushed him away, causing his face to contort into an even angrier mask. The second Sarah pushed him away, she felt something cold and sharp enter her back. She didn't even have time to realize what had happened, as her body was instantly engulfed by overwhelming pain. The man's hand, no longer just a man, slid down her back, leaving deep cuts, and then, with terrible ease, pulled something out of her body that shouldn't have been there. Her gaze fell to the floor. Everything has slowed down. She saw the bloody footprints on the floor, but she couldn't figure out what had happened to her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out of her throat, only a moan full of impotence. The man seemed oblivious to her suffering. He stood like a statue, his face was no longer distorted, but instead was almost calm, as if he had just completed a long and important ritual. But despite his outward composure, his eyes were filled with some kind of dark joy. "You don't understand, Sarah," his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You've become a part of something bigger than you ever imagined." Her eyes began to dim, and her last remaining strength was rapidly draining away. She tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She felt the world around her disappearing, as the sounds began to get lost in the void. But before the darkness engulfed her, she noticed something that really threw her off balance. Jake. The boy, her son, stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with horror. He didn't move. He didn't scream. His face was as white as chalk, his lips were trembling, and he was holding a knife in his hands. The man noticed him, and in the blink of an eye, his face took on an expression that Sarah wouldn't have had time to describe even if she could. He turned to the boy and whispered, "You've made your choice." Jake raised the knife, and at that moment, Sarah realized the most terrible thing. She only had time to notice how the tip of the knife descended into her son's chest before her own life faded away.